If you're like me and you recently graduated, but you've been so used to studying for the past couple of years that now that you have free time to yourself, your brain is so used to learning new things and you need to constantly stimulate it, then you've come to the right place. In this video, I am going to recommend 4 books that I highly recommend you read in 2026. And these books are going to make you become dangerously smarter. If that's something that you're interested in, stick around for more. But before we get to it, hi, I'm Lonimi Maseko, and on this channel, I make self-development content. If that's something that you're interested in, hope you stick around. The first book I want to recommend is called 17 to Millionaire by the author Douglas Price. And when I tell you this book significantly changed the way I see finance and investing, I'm not kidding. So if you're Canadian like me, you live in Canada and you are looking to really build your wealth over time, but you don't know where to start, 17 to Millionaire is such a great place to start. And I'm so glad a good friend of mine recommended it to me earlier this year. So you don't necessarily have to be a Canadian or live in Canada to read the book. I do believe that the main financial terminologies that the author is trying to convey in his book can be applied to many of us from around the world, especially when it comes to investing, right? So the main thesis of the author is that if you're young, from as little as 17, it's so important that you start investing, creating an investment account, and you start investing. And the more you make investments, those investments are going to compound over time so that you can end up building wealth for yourself later in, let's say, your 30s or your 40s or even beyond that, right? And when I tell you the way he explains in the book, he understands that financial terminologies, it's not something that a lot of people know. So he really explains it like a 12-year-old or even I would even say a 9-year-old is the audience, right? And he does a great job at breaking down financial terms to help you understand how you can start investing. This book really changed my view because before reading the book, I honestly viewed investing as something that was very risky, as like a gambling activity. So he does a good job at making you see that by investing smarter, you can really create wealth for yourself in the long run. So, how do you invest? According to the author, he says that it's important to first establish or create a tax-free savings account. And in this account, you can invest in whatever you want to, whatever company or indexed funds or exchange traded funds, short for ETFs, that you would like to invest in. He really encourages you to start doing that. Now, if you want me to break down his arguments in another video, let me know. But I'm just going to define what an index fund is for the sake of time. So according to him, he describes an index fund as like, picture this, a bucket. And in this bucket, you have different candies, and each candies basically represents different companies that are all accumulated into one specific index, which is the bucket. And when you're investing in an index fund, you are literally diversifying your portfolio and investing in different companies, let's say tech companies like Apple, Samsung, Google, and what have you. You're basically investing in this index and you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, which increases your returns, your chances of getting a return over time. But let's say if you invest in an individual stock, he says that that's not really recommended for baby investors like me, because you need to start by investing in different companies so that you don't really run into the risk of losing money because you put all your eggs in one basket. According to him, a company, from my understanding, can lose its value over time. Maybe a company that is super popular today may not be valued as high in the future because times change. The market is very volatile. So I highly recommend you read this book. I can't stress it enough. I after I finished reading the book, and with the help of my uncle who also invests, I was able to start investing, and the book really changes your views on investing. He also basically debunks a lot of myths that are tied to investing, and he really makes you see that it's something that can be fun, especially if you open your mind to it. Something I quickly forgot to mention is that when you're reading the book and the author is explaining financial terminologies that are known to people living in Canada, but let's say you're reading the book and you don't necessarily live in Canada, what I recommend that you do is search what is the equivalency of the financial term that the author is trying to explain in your home country. So let's say, as we spoke about earlier, right, the tax-free savings account, that is something that people living in Canada have access to. But if you don't live in Canada, you can just go online, make a quick search and say, what is the equivalency of a tax-free savings account to your home country? Let's say you're watching this from the USA, and I believe the equivalency is a Roth IRA, right? So yeah, you can do those conversions as you're reading the book, but honestly, I do believe that you will greatly benefit from reading the book, even if you don't necessarily live in Canada. The next book I want to recommend is called Astrophysics for People in a Hurry by Neil deGrasse Tyson. When I tell you this book made me fall in love with astrophysics and the cosmos, it would not be an exaggeration. So the author in the beginning of the book takes us all the way back to 14 billion years ago, before the planet came into existence. So conditions in the universe at the time were basically significantly hot, and the universe was very dense. As billions of years passed, the universe started to expand rapidly and it became extremely cool over time. So the author throughout the book, he talks about the significant inventions that were made, which greatly contributed to the advancement of astrophysics studies, like the telescope, for example. And then one chapter that stood out to me was the chapter on dark energy. So, according to the author, we don't know what dark energy is, but all astrophysics know about it is that 68% of the mass energy in the universe is comprised of dark energy. And then I want to read a passage in the book where the author really sells this point home. And it's a passage that really made me blow my mind about dark energy. So he says, and this is between pages 110 to 111. So the author says, and I quote, give me a sec. Quote, "So what is the stuff? Nobody knows. The closest anybody has come is to presume dark energy is a quantum effect, where the vacuum of space, instead of being empty, actually seethes with particles and their antimatter counterparts. They pop in and out of existence in pairs and don't last long enough to be measured. Their transient existence is captured in their moniker, virtual particles. The remarkable legacy of quantum physics, the science of the small, demands that we give this idea serious attention." When I tell you this passage blew my mind, for me, the reason why it blew my mind is because the idea that something can just pop in and out into existence, it completely defies the laws of gravity. In planet Earth, I've never seen that before. The idea that something can just pop in and out into existence and we don't know what it is, it blows my mind. So there's just something extremely mysterious and fascinating about studying the cosmos and the universe. And the more you read this book, the more you just want to learn more about what is the universe, what are all these mysteries. The author also talks about different planets in our solar systems and their compositions. And by the way, can I just say, the fact that Pluto lost its tenure as a planet really made me upset. All my life as a child, I believed that Pluto was one of the planets in the solar system. But to figure out through this book that astrophysics basically got together at some point and they determined the standards of what makes a planet, and Pluto didn't meet the criteria, so therefore it was demoted to a dwarf planet. I was like, what? Anyways, that really made me question it, but Yeah, you get a lot of moments like that in the book where things you thought you used to believe, the author kind of debunks that and he makes you see things in a different perspective. And I also really love the way he writes. He writes the book, especially if you're somebody like me and before reading the book, I honestly felt that astrophysics was very intimidating. There were a lot of scientific terms that I wasn't familiar with. But when you read the book, the author, he does a really good job at explaining the basics of the cosmos, the universe, our solar system, astrophysics, and he compounds it into one little book. And you greatly learn so much by reading this book. I also want to finish this point by saying that if you are used to being depressed or you have a lot of anxiety, there's just something very liberating that happens when you read a book like Astrophysics for people in a hurry, because it forces you to really get outside, zoom out of your problems, and see that we're nothing as human beings but specks of dust in the huge cosmic network or channel that is the universe. So, the third book I would like to recommend is called The 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. And this historical book is a must read, especially in 2026, especially if you want to educate yourself on current geopolitical conflicts that are happening around the world, especially the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So the author divides the book into six main sections where he would talk about periods of declarations of war that Israel has waged against Palestine from 1917 to 2017. He also talks about how the Zionist movement has been a movement that has been supported and espoused by Britain in the beginning, followed by the US. A passage that stood out to me was in the introduction when the author, who is, by the way, Palestinian, and the book is reading from a Palestinian perspective, the author was talking about how his great 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 uncle Yusuf al-Dia Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi, who used to be the mayor of Jerusalem, and he basically sensed how this ominous foreboding that the Zionist propaganda was trying to promote. So the Zionist propaganda was trying to promote this idea at the time that the Zionists wanted to colonize Palestine. And because Yusuf really wanted to protect Palestine, he wrote a letter to the leader of the Zionist movement at the time, Theodor Herzl, who also was a journalist from Vienna. And he wrote Herzl a letter, basically in a polite way, asking Herzl to leave the Palestinians alone. And this letter was written in March 1st of 1899. Based on the manifestations that we can see today of the atrocities that Palestinians continue to face in Gaza, I think we can basically guess what the outcome of the response letter that Theodor Herzl sent to Yusuf entailed. So, honestly, I'm still reading the book. It's a very tough read, and it forces you to really face a lot of the misconceptions that you may have had with regards to the conflict. Prior to reading this book, honestly, especially from my Christian background, I was taught to believe that Israel is this holy land. It's a spiritual land. That's the land where Jesus walked. So therefore, one shouldn't really study too much into things and educates oneself about conflicts happening there. I was generally extremely ignorant, but with the help of conversation I had with Muslim friends, and also with I was noticing was happening in Gaza and the huge violations of human rights committed against them by the Israeli government, I started to think, okay, no, I became significantly disillusioned. And this book also really helps you to, just really educate yourself on this conflict. and it debunks a lot of maybe misconceptions that you may have had about the conflict. So I highly recommend the book. It's tough to read, but I think it's necessary. The final book I want to recommend is called 101 essais qui vont changer votre façon de penser, which is the French translation for the original book called 101 Essays That Will Change the Way You Think by Brianna West. She is one of my all-time favorite authors, and I've already read 2 other books from her. So in this book, the self-help book, the author is talking about basically she's trying to give you tips on how to improve your quality of life by challenging the way you've been conditioned to think your entire life. And then she also talks about challenges that you've continued to face in your daily life, whether it's challenges regarding getting a job, being in a relationship, or addressing underlying traumas that you haven't really quite addressed your entire life. And I also really like how there was this chapter where she was talking about procrastination and why it's important to just take action rather than dwelling on our thoughts all day long. And I really liked the chapter. So for let's say for example, you're watching this and one of your goals or your dreams is to start a YouTube channel. Right? Her argument would be that rather than really always dwelling on the thought and just dwelling on fear, when you dwell on fear, you're allowing fear to take control of your life. But when you take action, even if the dream, the goal that you want to accomplish in your life, it seems so difficult, by you just taking that first step to begin to launch something, it's you acknowledging your future self and making those necessary taking those necessary steps to accomplish your dreams and get to your future goals faster. But when you procrastinate, when you dwell too much on your thoughts about, oh, what if it's going to fail? What if this is going to happen? You're not really taking action. So I really loved that chapter. I'm still reading it as well. I recently got this book at the bookstore and already I'm falling in love with it. I really, really wanted to recommend it though. I think one critique I can give to the book, even if Brianna is one of my favorite authors, is that because I've read her other books, I feel like some of her arguments sometimes appear in the books, and sometimes her arguments can sometimes be a bit repetitive. But that's maybe because I've read her other books. Maybe you've never heard of the author before, and this is the first time you're being introduced to her. So you reading this book may not seem like her arguments are being repetitive. So, anyways, it depends. If you've made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments if you've read some of the books I recommended, or let me know what books you are interested perhaps in reading based on the recommendations I made. I also would love to hear recommendations from you. I am in the process of wanting to also start reading geography books. I specifically also want to read books regarding the geopolitical conflict that is in South Sudan, but I haven't really found any books that interest me. So if you know of any author that comes from the country that has written a book about the conflict going on, please let me know in the comments below. And also please recommend other really good geography books. I would love to read them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.